Hello, I'm Dr. David Burt. I'm an immunologist and a Seventh-day Adventist Christian based in Toronto, Canada. And I'm so excited and honored to be invited to join you for your convocation on Sabbath, November 13. The COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating for us all, both on a personal and societal level. During the past year, I've had the privilege of working as a member of the City of Toronto's Black Scientist Task Force on Vaccine Equity, to provide our community with accurate information to make informed decisions about COVID-19 and vaccines. On November 13, I'll be speaking on the topic, COVID-19, Separating Fact from Fiction. And I'll be sharing information about COVID vaccine history, hesitancy, and reality, especially as it relates to our Christian community. This will also be a great opportunity for us to discuss your questions about COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines. I'm really looking forward to being with you virtually on November 13. Until then, take care and God bless. I'm going to talk about the benefits and the risks related to the COVID vaccine. And I'm sure that this afternoon we'll get into a bit more detail, in terms of some of the things you've read and heard about on social media. But today, or this morning, I just want to get into a sort of introduction to the whole situation. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see if it works. We did try it a few minutes ago and it worked quite well. Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Let me put the slideshow. Good. Okay. COVID-19, separating fact from fiction. And I'm going to start, I was going to leave this to the end, but I'm going to start now because COVID has had a major impact, not just on our health, but also on our psyche. And vaccination against COVID has been politicized and spiritualized. And I know, because I follow the US quite carefully, and in the US, it's often a badge of honor determining whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. I'm not sure where the independents come, but also Christians especially have strong views for and against vaccination. And really this has created a lot of disunity, mistrust among members and between the members and the leadership. And I don't know if you've actually looked at some of the panels that have been put on about COVID in our church, but some of the rhetoric and the discussion on the chat has been crazy. It's caused a lot of disunity. It's causing rifts in families. And despite this, all of the major religions and Christian denominations, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church, support vaccination as a legitimate way of preventing infectious disease. And we also know that the Seventh-day Adventist Church statement on vaccination also recognizes the right of an individual to choose to be vaccinated or not. So, what should be our response to COVID vaccines? As Seventh-day Adventist Christians, we should recognize every person's right to choose and treat one another with respect and love as Christ admonishes us to do. John 13:35, by this will all men know that you are my disciples if you love one another. So it's important for our witness, because if we're creating so much tension and aggro within our congregations and our church, how are we going to witness to others? And I like what Dr. Eric Walsh said on a recent panel. He said, our enemy is not our brother or the general conference or the person who questions the need for vaccines or the pharmaceutical companies or the government. Our enemy is Satan. So I hope you'll remember that as we get into this discussion this morning. Now, Jonathan, Pastor Smith, gave us some really interesting information about Arizona. I wasn't aware that COVID is the leading cause of death in Arizona, and that's remarkable. So that puts me on the spot here because I've got a tremendous responsibility today. But I hope that as I present some of the facts around COVID and COVID vaccines, and this is based on evidence-based science, not hearsay or things that we get from social media, but evidence-based science. And today we know that there are at least 253 million cases of COVID worldwide. And I'm sure that's an underestimation because not every country is testing thoroughly. Over 5 million deaths. And in the US, corona cases, 47 million. And even with those conservative figures, it tells us that 1 in 7 individuals in the US has contracted COVID. Deaths, 781,000. And it tells us that 1 in 427 individuals in the US has died because of COVID. Those are stark figures. And often you'll hear, I guess on social media especially, the death rate, there's no excess mortality or death during this COVID period compared to previous years, but that's not true. If you analyze many countries, you'll find that there has been excess mortality during the waves of COVID. And this data shows information for the UK, Italy, and the United States. And you see during the waves, there have been excess deaths compared to the last 5 years or the previous prior to COVID. And some of those excess deaths are double the amount of deaths that you normally find in those periods. So COVID has had an impact in terms of death. And we know that in terms of the age-related impact of COVID, and this data from the CDC is comparing rates for infection, hospitalization, and death by age, comparing them to the 5 to 17-year-olds. While the cases, the risk for COVID doesn't change a lot with age, we know the hospitalization rates and the death rates accelerate and increase as we go up in age. What about the demographic in terms of race and ethnic groups? Unfortunately, it's clear that in terms of hospitalizations and death and cases, racialized individuals and ethnic groups have been hit the hardest. So American Indians, Blacks, Hispanics have nearly twice as much cases of COVID compared to white individuals. Hospitalization up to 4 times the number of cases, and deaths up to 3 times. And we know that this isn't because of any genetic defect or genetic reason. It's really because of the fact that racialized and ethnic individuals are often essential workers on the front line. They don't work from home. They're exposed to COVID more than others. Also, because of systemic racism, we know that the racialized and ethnic groups have been impacted tremendously. So there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of disease factors that correspond, as we see later, with risk factors for COVID. And you'll see that also this is played out in the confidence that different groups have in terms of taking a vaccine for COVID. In September of last year, half of African Americans said, we're not going to take the vaccine. And that was much less than what was seen for Hispanics and whites. Now, this did improve by December. So there is some movement, some confidence gaining now in the community, especially in the Black community. But we know that there are issues, again, related to historical medical injustices that have happened in the past in the Black community, and injustices now, and unfairness in terms of how the medical system works. So that's not surprising. Now, in the US, 67.5% of the population have had at least one dose, and 58% have had 2 doses. But this doesn't tell the whole story, because what we see, and this is for African Americans in different communities, different states, we see that as a proportion of the population, we have the highest number of cases and deaths, but we have a very low uptake of the vaccine compared to other groups. And so this is a situation that we face. And I want to talk about this morning the benefits versus the risks of taking COVID-19 vaccines when we relate this to infection and vaccine safety. And why I'm talking about the benefits and the risks is because everything we do in life, in every case, we have to weigh up the benefits and the risks. Sometimes we do this subconsciously, but for instance, if you're thinking of taking a plane ride within the US, you know that that's an efficient way to travel. You also know that occasionally, and this is rare, on rare occasions, there are plane crashes, and when that happens, there are tremendous deaths, and it's an awful situation. But you know also that plane travel is one of the safest ways to travel. And so we weigh the benefits and the risks, and for most of us, we don't hesitate to take the plane, although sometimes we might be a bit hesitant. And the seatbelt situation is another situation that I'd like to bring out, because we know seatbelts save lives in a car crash. And wearing a seatbelt reduces the risk of fatal injury by up to 50% if you're in the front seat, up to 75% if you're in the rear seat. But we also know that there's a risk, and it's a minor risk, but there are risks in wearing seatbelts. Seatbelts can cause terrible injuries in the abdomen, the head, and the chest. But despite these risks, we wear a seatbelt because, again, benefit outweighs the risk. And this is how I want us to look at some of the information about COVID vaccines this morning. And hopefully it will help us to put the whole issue of vaccination in context, and especially for those who are still hesitant about taking a COVID vaccine. I hope this will help. Now, I like this, this image of the different protective measures that we have against COVID. And these are represented by slices of Swiss cheese. So we have physical distancing, mask wearing, proper hygiene, proper ventilation, quarantine and isolation if necessary, vaccines and pills. And the originator of this schematic chose Swiss cheese because he wanted to remind us that individually, none of these interventions are perfect. So if we don't wear a mask properly, or we don't wear the proper mask to the right situation, it's not going to protect us against COVID, and it's not going to prevent us from transmitting it. And it's the same for hand washing, and even for vaccines. Vaccines are not perfect. Even if a vaccine is 90% protective, it means a 10% chance that you could be infected. And we'll talk about pills later on this afternoon, because there's some new drugs that are out there that might be useful in treating COVID. So individually, none of these measures can actually do a great job. But together, when we have the multiple layers together, we dramatically reduce the risk of infection and transmission. And if you're careful, if you've got good eyes, you'll see this mouse, and this is the mouse of misinformation. So this mouse is nibbling away at many of the layers. It's causing confusion, mistrust, and it's misleading a lot of individuals. And this is coming from social media. Today, this morning, we're going to talk mainly about vaccines. So why vaccines? Vaccines have a great legacy. Vaccines were first developed not in 1700, but centuries before. There's a process called variolation that was in China and in Africa. And in fact, this was to protect individuals against smallpox. And they take some of the pus from one individual who was infected and put it into another individual. And it wasn't the safest way to protect against smallpox, but it did reduce the numbers of infections. And actually, a slave called Onesimus, who was brought to the United States, helped the situation in Boston when he told his slave owner that there was a way that they used in Africa to prevent smallpox. So smallpox was first used as a real vaccine in the late 1700s. And since then, we've had vaccines developed against polio, tuberculosis, hepatitis B, Ebola vaccine last year. And the vaccines that we have now are part of this legacy of vaccination. And as we've gone through the decades, the techniques and the improvements of science has made these vaccines much more effective and much safer and much purer. And we know that vaccines have eradicated common diseases. Vaccines work. If you look at many of these diseases like measles, pertussis, mumps, rubella, smallpox, polio, after the introduction of vaccines, the incidence of these diseases and this is data for the US, was reduced by 90% and sometimes 100%. Smallpox has been eradicated throughout the world. Polio is almost there to be eradicated. So vaccines work. What about the COVID vaccines? 7.4 billion, this is as of yesterday, 7.4 billion doses have been administered globally, and 24.93 million are now administered every day. A staggering 51.5% of the world has received at least one dose. Unfortunately, only 4.5% of people in low-income countries have received at least one dose. And this is an issue, and we have to look at this carefully, because as long as COVID is circulating somewhere in the world, there's always a possibility the pandemic will not be dealt with efficiently. And as of June 2021, in the UK, it's estimated that COVID has prevented 7.2 million infections and 27,000 deaths in the UK alone. In the United States, prevented an estimated 279,000 deaths and up to 1.25 million hospitalizations. So the COVID vaccine, just like the vaccines in the past, are working. So let's talk about them in a bit more detail. We are here looking at the vaccines that you know well, that have been approved or almost approved. But these are just the tip of the iceberg, because there are still, as of 25th of October, there's still about 150 vaccines in development somewhere in the world, in different phases of clinical studies. 8 have been approved, 8 have been abandoned. And people don't realize that it's not a slam dunk that you develop a vaccine and it's going to work. Vaccines have been abandoned because they haven't been effective, or the benefits haven't outweighed the risks. We always hear a lot about the mRNA vaccines and the vaccines that we have now and how rapidly they were developed. And it's true. I mean, the speed was amazing. The first report of SARS-CoV-2 was in December 31, 2019. The sequence of the whole virus was determined in January. And by February, there was data in mice. This was data produced by Kizzy Corbett's team in the National Institutes for Health, a Black woman who's really pioneered this work, and this is a Moderna vaccine. And by March 16th, the first clinical studies were done. And we know that by the end of December, this vaccine and others were authorized for use. This was done not because any steps were bypassed, but because a lot of the work, especially from Kizzy Corbett's lab and others, was performed on other coronaviruses. A lot of the research was done between 2013 and 2019. The delivery system for the virus was worked on decades before, and we know the governments poured in trillions of dollars, and also the clinical trials were performed in a way that enabled us to determine as soon as possible if the vaccine worked or not. And if it didn't work, you'd go back to the drawing board. Thankfully, we have a number of vaccines that worked, and these studies were done without compromising any safety issues. The regulatory authorities still intervened and determined whether the vaccines could move ahead. Now, vaccines work. Why? Because we have an immune system. And so when you're infected with SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19, there's a protein on the surface called the spike protein that interacts with a receptor on cells in many parts of the body, but especially in the lungs. It's called the ACE2 receptor. And this allows the virus to get in. The virus hijacks our molecular biological mechanisms to make copies of itself that are that burst out of the cell that's infected, and then our immune system is activated. We generate B cells that make antibodies, T cells that can actually attack the virus. And some of these cells become memory cells, so that when the virus comes back again, we have this army of immune cells ready and waiting. Now, of course, associated with this infection is disease, hospitalization, and death. What about the vaccines? Well, the vaccines work in a very similar way. We're talking about the mRNA vaccines now. Now, mRNA is a very unstable molecule. So it has to be, to get it into the cell, to protect it without it being destroyed, it has to be wrapped in a bubble of fat or lipid. It gets into the cell, the ribosomes translate the recipe or the message for the S protein from the RNA into the protein. The protein is recognized by the immune system, and the immune system reacts just as if it was seeing a foreign entity, makes antibodies. You have memory cells that can actually now protect us when the real virus comes along. And you notice that these mRNA, it doesn't get in, it's not, this is a nucleus where our DNA is, it doesn't touch the DNA. And in fact, it's degraded very rapidly, the mRNA. So there's no way that this is going to interfere with our genetic, our DNA or our genome. And it doesn't last very long. And this is because we don't need the vaccine to be around very long, because 99% of the work that a vaccine does is done by the immune system. The vaccine is destroyed rapidly, the immune system takes over and does most of the work. So what happened when the clinical studies were done? Well, we know that there was a lot of great enrollment. Sometimes it takes years to get this number of individuals to participate in a clinical study. But because of the fact that we're in COVID and people could see the pandemic, there were a lot of volunteers. So most studies had tens of thousands of individuals, including a good representation of different ethnic groups and cultural groups. Most had between 10 and 70% African Americans or Blacks. Others had sometimes up to 30% are Latino. So these studies were done and performed, and the results, as we know, were just tremendous. Remember, before the results came out, the regulatory authorities said if we had a vaccine that would protect to 50%, that would be something, we would take that. These vaccines, the efficacy based on being able to prevent infection that was confirmed by a lab was up to 95%. And some of the DNA vaccines had a lower efficacy, but these trials were done at a time when some of the variants were around. So we shouldn't take too much information from that. But we know that the vaccines protected against severe COVID, hospitalization, and death. And when they were rolled out, Israel was one of the first countries that rapidly vaccinated its population. And what did we see? The Pfizer vaccine was 97% effective in illness, just like the clinical studies. This was in millions of individuals. And this data, this same type of data was seen throughout the various countries that actually tested the vaccine. But we know that 8 months or 9 months after the first individuals in Israel were vaccinated, we started to see some strange things. First of all, it seemed that individuals who were vaccinated initially in January in Israel started to get ill. They were double vaccinated, but they started to get COVID. And the efficacy of the vaccine started to wane. And this corresponds to the time period when the virus came along. And you know, because of the success of the vaccine initially in Israel, Israel opened up. There was no need to wear masks anymore. Everyone was celebrating that things were over, but they didn't really understand the fact that there could be mutant viruses or variants coming along like Delta. And also, we didn't have a good handle on how long the actual vaccine protected for. So this is similar data from the UK, so from the US, in 13 states. And this line separates the time when Delta was less than 50% and over 50% circulating. And we see in terms of the number of cases, up to June, the number of cases were going down. Even case numbers were going down in the US. Again, a clear distinction, the vaccine was protecting, but the cases were going down. But as soon as Delta started to rise, the cases started going up in the unvaccinated and even in the vaccinated. But when you looked at hospitalization, although the cases were going up in the unvaccinated and in terms of deaths, the cases were still pretty low. And basically, there was hardly any impact in terms of hospitalizations and deaths for individuals who were vaccinated. But they were seeing some, what we call now, breakthrough infections. Did this mean the vaccine wasn't working? No, definitely not. Because by August, when they were looking at the breakthrough infections, they found that the vaccinated Americans tested positive COVID. So 19% of those who were vaccinated, had the full vaccine regimen, were still protected. There were some breakthrough cases in 0.07%, hospitalizations in 0.004%, and deaths in 0.001%. So the vaccine was still working, and breakthrough cases, although there's a lot of publicity in the media, the breakthrough cases were very rare. So the vaccine was still preventing you from getting COVID. By October, after more than 189 million people had been vaccinated, there was reports from 50 states, excuse me, of 41 100,000 individuals with COVID who were hospitalized or who had died. So these were individuals who were, vaccinated twice, but they only represented 0.02% of those who were vaccinated. And if you look at the demographic of the individuals, we know that the majority of the breakthrough cases occurred in individuals who had comorbidities, risk factors for COVID, and were over 75 in age and immunosuppressed. And about 70% of the breakthrough cases resulting in hospitalization were among the adults 65 and older, and about 87% of the cases resulting in death were among adults 65 and older. And we know that the elderly and the immunosuppressed don't always produce a good immune response to the vaccine. And so this is the group that was succumbing to the so-called breakthrough infections. So that's why now booster immunizations have been recommended and have been used now for individuals in these high-risk groups. And sometimes we think, oh, these health officials and regulatory people, they don't know what they're doing. But remember, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and many vaccines that we've had in the past require 2 or 3 doses, like the hepatitis B vaccine. You need 3 doses to get full immunity. The measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, you need 3 doses. Influenza, you only need 1. So it takes time to determine what the level of immunity or how many vaccinations you need to get the right level of immunity. And we're finding this out now for these individuals in these groups. Now we know that the vaccines are still protecting people against hospitalization. So Moderna, 95%, Pfizer, 80%, Johnson & Johnson, 60%. And in fact, this is what vaccines are supposed to do. Very few of the vaccines that we've developed in the past protect you against infection. What they do and what they're supposed to do is to protect you against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And the vaccines are still doing that now. And so we know that, that after Delta became the most common variant, vaccinated individuals have a reduced risk of infection of 5-fold compared to non-vaccinated. Your risk of hospitalization is reduced by more than 10-fold, and death more than 10-fold. So the vaccines are still working. And unfortunately, more than 9 in 10 individuals who are in hospital at this time for COVID have not been vaccinated. This is a fact. This is seen in many states. And this is why there's still outbreaks occurring, especially in Europe, in the US. Now people are having to go back to wear masks because, unfortunately, with the drive to get the economy going again, we've forgotten that variants occur. We don't know how long the vaccine, the immunity is going to last. And so masks have been taken off. Everything's been opened up. I was in the UK a few weeks ago, and if you go to a soccer stadium, 30,000 people are there shouting and singing and with no masks. And so that's why the UK is struggling at this time. So really it's important, even though you're vaccinated, it's important to wear masks. And just one other piece of information before we move to the next section is that masks, what I was going to say now, just one more piece of information. Yes, even though these vaccines are meant to prevent infection and transmission, and people are already saying that you're vaccinated and can still transmit the virus. Yes, you can, but CDC have done studies showing that individuals who are vaccinated have 40% less virus in their lungs. They're protected from severe illness, And because they have less virus, it means they're going to be less impacted or be transmitting less. Let's quickly go to vaccine safety. These vaccines for COVID, they cause the same type of mild discomforts that we get from vaccination, reactions at the site, joint pain, some chills, but these don't last very long. But we know that there are some rare events that you didn't see during the trials, but you saw during the rollout to millions of individuals. One is myocarditis. Now, not many people know that myocarditis occurs after being infected with COVID. Since last year, when the pandemic started, CDC was looking at the rate of myocarditis in people with COVID compared to people who didn't have COVID. And there's a 16-fold higher risk of myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle, in individuals who have been infected. So infection, which we always hear about vaccination and myocarditis, but infection with COVID causes myocarditis. What about vaccination? Well, this number here is 150, in terms of COVID, 150 cases per 100,000, 150 cases per 100,000, which is 1,500 cases per million. What do we see in the high-risk groups for myocarditis? Females, 8 to 10 cases per million, 56 to 69 cases in males that are more impacted per million. So the risk of myocarditis is reduced 150-fold and 22-fold compared to getting a COVID infection. So myocarditis is less prominent after vaccination compared to when you get COVID. So you reduce the risk of myocarditis when you're vaccinated. And in addition, you also reduce hospitalizations, cases, ICU admissions, and deaths. There are other cases of rare adverse events after vaccination. We know about the cases with allergy, 5 to 11 cases per million, 2.5 cases per million for Moderna. But we know that these can be dealt with at the site. That's why you wait for a few minutes, maybe half an hour after you get the vaccine. EpiPen will prevent any of these rare cases. Facial paralysis is one situation where we find that the numbers of individuals getting facial paralysis is Bell's palsy. This is a temporary paralysis of the face. 183 cases per million, 197 cases per million. But the average in the community, without vaccinations or COVID, cases are up between 150 and 300 cases. So there's no real increase. And again, if you get COVID, there are 800 cases per million of facial paralysis. So again, in terms of facial paralysis, getting the vaccine is better than getting COVID. Blood clots, let's quickly go into blood clots. And it's the same situation here. After COVID, and this was 500,000 people were analyzed in the UK. Those who got COVID, 39 cases of cerebral venous thrombosis, 39 cases per million. After the vaccines, 5, 4, very rare events. So we know also that the health authorities have determined that because the benefits in under 40s, in terms of AstraZeneca vaccine, for instance, the benefits don't really outweigh the potential, the risks for this group. Health authorities decided that over 40s can get AstraZeneca, but the under 40s shouldn't, because there's no real benefit. Even though the incidence is low, there's no real benefit for them to take the vaccine. So even health authorities use the benefits and risks ratio. Quickly, that's a couple of slides. What about the long-term effects of COVID, we're asked. And it's true, we don't know the long-term effects of COVID vaccines, but we have some indication from the legacy of vaccines in the past. Because vaccines aren't drugs that you give chronically, like a drug for diabetes or hypertension. A vaccine is given once or twice, localized, and it's the immune system that deals with the infection. And most vaccines are destroyed within 2 to 3 days, so they don't hang around in the body. And virtually all cases in the past, of all the vaccines that we've developed and used in the past and received, the rare but serious side effects are seen within the first 2 months. This was seen in polio, swine flu, and rotavirus. These are examples where there were some initial cases of rare events, very rare, one case in 2.4 million of polio when it was first developed. There's a bad batch, but this occurred within 1 to 4 weeks. Swine flu, Guillain-Barré syndrome, within 8 weeks. Rotavirus, bowel obstruction, within 3 to 7 days. And we see this with vaccines for COVID now. AstraZeneca, blood clots within 6 to 14 days, myocarditis within 30 days, and myocarditis can be treated very, very easily now with anti-inflammatory drugs. So we know that when we believe that there aren't going to be any long-term effects of the vaccine in terms of safety, but we know that there is long-haul symptoms of COVID after infection. 10% of individuals record and have to get treatment for difficulty in breathing, tiredness, chest pains, myalgia, 6 months after getting COVID. So we know what the medium to long-term issues are with getting COVID. And I'll finish with this. Is it better to get COVID from infection or vaccination? COVID infection does protect from reinfection. By 84%, a study in UK, 80%, a study in Denmark, but that protection fell to about 47% in the elderly. But we know now that combining vaccination with infection provides an even stronger immunity. And these were studies that have been done and recently published in Nature and Science, that you get a better protection against the existing original viruses and Delta if you have the vaccine, at least one dose of vaccine after infection. And so that's why health authorities are recommending that even if you've been infected, you should get a second dose of the vaccine. So just to finish here, infection-induced immunity and vaccination, each providing protection, but infection has risk. If you're infected, you can get COVID, hospitalization, and death, and the long-haul symptoms of COVID. Also, as I demonstrated, all of these rare but serious impacts that you see after getting the vaccine, they're much more prevalent after getting COVID. So you reduce the risk also of myocarditis, blood clots, and facial paralysis. So the benefits of vaccination more than outweigh any risks caused by the vaccine themselves. And I hope that this has helped you to really consider COVID vaccine in terms of infection, protection, and safety in a new light, because everything we do in life, we compare the risks and the benefits, and we make our choice based on that. I think I'll stop there. And this afternoon, we can go into some more detail. I'm sure there are a lot of questions around this topic, and we can deep dive into some of them later on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burt. For those of you who want to ask questions, we want you to come back at 3 o'clock. We have set that time aside for questions and answers regarding this presentation and the information that you've received. And so we want you to come back at 3 o'clock, and then you can ask questions directly to Dr. Burt regarding COVID, vaccines, etc. Thank you so much for joining us for this breakout session. You don't want to leave because we're going to have a wonderful Sabbath school program, divine worship with a good friend of mine, Pastor Deblier Snell, the speaker director-elect for Breath of Life Ministries. And then back here at 3 o'clock, Dr. Burt will be answering your questions about COVID and vaccines. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless you. We're going to leave the breakout room, but we'll see you back at 3 o'clock.
Okay, bye-bye.